It was the middle of the night when they moved my bed into the garage. It wasn't even the kind of thing I could pretend was an accident. Not when I heard the sound of the metal scraping against the concrete floor. A harsh, deliberate sound that cut through the silence of the house. The movers were efficient, their faces blank as they worked, and in the background, I could hear my son's voice. He was standing in the doorway looking back at me with an expression that I couldn't place. I tried to read it. Guilt? Indifference? Maybe a mixture of both. But all I could feel in that moment was the cold air creeping in through the thin cracks of the garage door, the kind of air that seemed to seep deep into my bones. "Just leave it there," my son said, his voice low. "Let her sleep with the rats." It wasn't the first time I'd heard that phrase. I had lived long enough to know that families often keep their harshest words hidden behind the guise of care. But this was different. This was the first time I truly felt it, like a weight pressing against my chest. I wanted to protest, to shout, but the words stuck in my throat, trapped in the realization that I wasn't a part of their life anymore. I wasn't even a part of their household. It was as if I was a relic they had forgotten to pack away, something old and useless, out of sight and out of mind. I watched them disappear down the hall, their footsteps growing fainter with every step, and I was left alone in the dim, sterile light of the garage. There was no warmth, no comfort, not even a sense of belonging. My bed, once the place where I had spent countless nights of rest and reflection, was now a cold, barren object, pushed into the corner like something discarded. I tried to make myself comfortable, to settle in for the night, but the ache in my body and the knot in my heart wouldn't let me rest. The pain wasn't physical, not really. It was the pain of being discarded by those I had loved and cared for, a pain that lodged itself deep inside me, too heavy to ignore. For hours, I lay there, staring at the shadows dancing on the concrete walls, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the occasional creak of the floorboards above me. It was strange how quiet everything felt, as though the world had paused to let me absorb the weight of what had just happened. I thought about the years I had spent raising my son, about the sacrifices I had made, the things I had given up for him, and for what? To be left in a garage like an old piece of furniture? I had raised him, I had given him everything, and now, in return, I was nothing but a burden. I could hear them upstairs laughing, talking, living their lives as if nothing had changed. And yet, everything had changed. In the quiet of the garage, I felt it more than ever. The deep, gnawing sense of alienation, the feeling of being completely invisible in my own home. They hadn't even asked if I was okay. They hadn't even looked back. They had simply assumed I would stay out of the way, that I would be content with the scraps they gave me. And maybe, for a time, I had been, but not anymore. The morning came slowly, a pale gray light seeping through the cracks in the garage door, casting long, thin shadows across the cold floor. I had barely slept, and when I tried to move, my joints screamed in protest. The bed was uncomfortable, the blankets too thin to provide any real warmth. But it wasn't just the physical discomfort that gnawed at me. It was the emotional emptiness that lingered in the air like a thick fog, clouding everything around me. I wanted to call my son, to tell him that I couldn't stay in this place any longer, that I deserved more than this. But the truth was, I didn't know where to go. I had nothing left but the remnants of a life I had spent years building, a life that had crumbled into dust the moment they decided I was no longer useful. I heard the sounds of their voices above me, the muffled conversation drifting down the stairs. But I didn't move. I didn't want to hear their excuses, their justifications for what they had done. I didn't want to listen to their hollow apologies, their empty reassurances that it was just a temporary situation, that things would get better. I knew better. I had lived long enough to know when someone was lying to me, when their words didn't match their actions. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't an oversight. This was intentional. The door to the garage creaked open, and my son appeared in the doorway, his face tight with something I couldn't quite read. Was it guilt? Regret? Or just the weight of something he couldn't bring himself to face? He didn't say anything. He just stood there, looking at me, his eyes avoiding mine, as if he couldn't bear to see the truth in them. I wanted to say something, to tell him that this wasn't the way it was supposed to be, that families didn't treat each other this way. But I didn't. The words seemed useless, like nothing I said would change what had already been done. He stepped back, and the door closed behind him with a soft click. The silence that followed was suffocating, as if the walls of the garage had closed in on me. I didn't know how long I stayed there, staring at the empty space where my bed had once been. But eventually, the reality of the situation began to settle in. I had been cast aside, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I had become inconvenient. I had outlived my usefulness. I had become a burden. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't about me being too old or too slow. This was about something deeper, something that had been building for years. Resentment, perhaps, or fear of what I represented. I wasn't just a mother or a grandmother. I was a reminder of the past, of the sacrifices they had made, of the things they had chosen to forget. But even in that moment of despair, something shifted inside me. A quiet, almost imperceptible shift, but one that would change everything. I wasn't going to stay in this garage waiting for them to decide when they were done with me. I wasn't going to let them strip away my dignity and leave me in the dark. No, I had something left. I had the power to choose, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. I didn't know where I would go or how I would get there, but I knew one thing. I was done waiting. I was done being invisible. And so, in that cold, empty garage, I made a decision. A small, quiet decision, but one that would set everything in motion. I wasn't going to wait for them to come back. I wasn't going to beg for their attention or their approval. I was going to take the first step toward something different, toward freedom, toward a life where I could be seen not as a burden, but as a person. And maybe, just maybe, that was all I needed to start over. It wasn't until the next morning that the full weight of what had happened really hit me. I woke up to the low hum of the refrigerator, the faint buzz of the fluorescent light in the garage flickering above me. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. The disorienting feeling of waking in a place that wasn't mine, in a bed that didn't feel like mine, and surrounded by nothing but cold concrete and the scent of stale air. I lay there for a long time, staring at the cracked ceiling, unable to move. The reality of it was like a slow, creeping wave that washed over me, and suddenly, everything seemed so painfully clear. My son and his wife, who had once been my world, had abandoned me. They had left me here, in this garage, like I was some kind of inconvenience they couldn't be bothered with. There was no apology, no explanation, just the cold silence of the house above me and the sound of their voices fading into the distance as they went about their day. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence that cut deeper than any words could. I tried to push the feeling away, tried to tell myself that this was just temporary, that they would come back for me, that this was just a misunderstanding. But as the minutes dragged on and the sun began to rise, I knew in my heart that I was lying to myself. The truth was undeniable. They had planned this. They had orchestrated it all. It wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't something they would regret. This was how they saw me now, something to be tolerated, something to be discarded when it became too much of a burden. And the worst part was, I had let them do it. I had let them push me aside, let them make decisions for me, and I had never questioned it. I had always been the one to give, the one to sacrifice, the one who stayed in the background while they lived their lives, while they built their futures. But now, I was the one left in the shadows, forgotten and alone. I pulled myself out of bed with a groan, the aches in my body making it feel like I was moving through molasses. My joints protested with every movement, but I didn't care. The pain was nothing compared to the emptiness that filled me. I shuffled to the small window in the corner of the garage, squinting against the weak morning light. The neighborhood was quiet, still wrapped in the early morning fog, and the only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was as if the world had gone on without me, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. My entire life had been turned upside down in the span of a single night, and now here I was, a woman who had been tossed aside, waiting for a family that would never come back for her. I thought about what I would do next. Should I wait for them to come and apologize, to admit that what they had done was wrong? Should I wait for them to beg for my forgiveness, to ask me to come back inside, to offer me some semblance of love and care? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I wasn't going to get that. They didn't see me anymore, not as a mother, not as a grandmother, not as a person. I was just an obstacle in their lives, something they had to manage, something they had to control. And that's when it hit me. I had no place in their lives anymore. They had made that very clear. I wasn't wanted, not in their home, not in their lives, not in any way that mattered. The phone in my pocket buzzed, breaking through the haze of my thoughts. I pulled it out, my fingers shaking as I unlocked it. It was a message from my son, one of the many messages I had ignored in the past few days. It read, "Mom, are you okay? We've been trying to reach you. Call us, please." We're worried. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button. I should call him, right? Shouldn't I? After all, he was my son, and I had raised him. I had given him everything I had, and now I was here, alone, with nothing but the remnants of the life I had once had. I could call him and pretend that everything was fine, that I was just waiting for the right moment to come home. But as I sat there, my fingers still poised over the phone, I realized that it wasn't just about calling him. It was about what I was calling for, what I was asking for. Was I really going to beg him for a place in his life? Was I going to grovel at his feet and beg him to see me again? Number. I wasn't going to do that. I wasn't going to allow myself to be that woman anymore. the woman who begged for scraps, who waited patiently for others to decide her worth. I was done with that. I was done being a passive participant in my own life. I was done waiting for someone else to decide what I deserved, done waiting for someone else to give me permission to live. I locked the phone and shoved it back into my pocket. I stood up and walked to the corner of the garage where a small table sat with an old, cracked lamp and a few forgotten boxes. The light flickered as I touched it, casting long shadows across the floor. I picked up one of the boxes and opened it, looking through the old photographs and trinkets inside. There were pictures of my son when he was young, of his first birthday, of the family vacations we used to take. I ran my fingers over the images, each one a reminder of a time when things were different, when we were a family. But those days were gone now, and I couldn't keep holding on to them, not when they no longer held any meaning. I closed the box and placed it back on the shelf. As I did, something else caught my eye. A small notebook, old and worn, sitting on the edge of the shelf. I hadn't seen it in years. It was the journal I used to write in when I was younger, before life got busy, before I became a mother, before everything changed. I took it down, dusted it off, and flipped through the pages. There were stories, poems, random thoughts. There was a time when I used to write every day, when I used to pour my heart onto the page, but somewhere along the way, I had stopped. I had stopped writing for myself and started writing for others, started living for others. But now, as I sat in this cold, empty garage, it felt like a sign that I needed to start again, that I needed to find my own voice, to reclaim my life. I didn't know how I was going to do it. I didn't know what the next step was or where I would go from here. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to wait any longer. I wasn't going to sit in this garage and let my life slip away. I wasn't going to let them define me, to decide my worth. I was going to take control, even if it meant leaving everything behind. Even if it meant stepping into the unknown. I closed the notebook, stood up, and took a deep breath. The world was still out there, still moving, still turning, and I was going to find my place in it. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew that for the first time in a long time, I was making the decision. I was the one choosing my next move, and that was enough. The days that followed were filled with a strange kind of numbness, a quiet that settled into every corner of my life like dust. I stayed in the garage, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know where else to go. My son's messages, the ones I had ignored, kept coming, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. Every time I read one, I felt a small, almost imperceptible sting of regret, but it was quickly overshadowed by the flood of anger and humiliation that followed. How could he do this to me? How could he treat me this way after everything I had done for him? I had given him everything, my love, my time, my resources, and this was how I was repaid. Abandoned, shoved aside like an old chair that no longer fit in their perfectly curated home. Every message, every attempt to make contact felt like a slap in the face. They wanted me to come back, to be the dutiful mother they could control, the grandmother they could call on when they needed someone to watch the kids, someone to cook, someone to do the things they didn't want to do themselves. But I wasn't that woman anymore. Not after what they had done to me. In the silence of the garage, I began to realize how much of my life had been shaped by others, how much I had given up to make space for their lives, for their needs. When I was younger, it had been easy to do. I had a family to care for, a house to run, a son to raise, and it all felt like the right thing to do. I had no regrets about those years, no regrets about the sacrifices I made. But now, as I sat in that cold, dimly lit space, I realized that somewhere along the way, I had lost myself. I had become someone who existed only in relation to others, someone who was always there when they needed me, but never asked for anything in return. I had become invisible, a shadow in my own life. The realization came slowly, but once it settled in, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I wasn't just angry at my son for what he had done. I was angry at myself for allowing it to happen. I was angry at myself for letting him and his wife walk all over me, for letting them treat me like I was disposable. I had spent so many years trying to please them, trying to be the perfect mother, the perfect grandmother, the perfect woman who never complained, never asked for anything. But in the process, I had lost everything that made me who I was. I had forgotten what it meant to have a voice, to have a choice. I had forgotten what it meant to live for myself. And that was when I decided to make a change. I wasn't going to sit in this garage any longer, waiting for them to come to their senses. I wasn't going to wait for them to apologize, to beg for my forgiveness, to tell me how sorry they were for what they had done. I knew that wasn't going to happen. They were too proud, too wrapped up in their own lives to care about what they had done to me. They didn't even see it as a betrayal. They saw it as a practical decision, a way to free up space in their home, a way to make their lives easier. And that's what hurt the most. The utter lack of understanding. The complete indifference to the years of love and sacrifice I had given them. I stood up from the bed, my knees creaking as I did. The physical pain in my body was a constant reminder of the years I had spent taking care of others, putting my own needs last, always putting myself at the bottom of the list. But now, for the first time in a long time, I was beginning to think about myself. I had no idea where I would go or what I would do, but I knew that I couldn't stay here, in this garage, waiting for someone else to decide my fate. I needed to take control, to find a way to start over, to rebuild my life on my own terms. The first step was simple. I had to leave. I wasn't going to stay in this garage, waiting for a family that had clearly moved on without me. I wasn't going to stay in a place where I wasn't wanted, where I wasn't seen. I needed to find a place where I could be myself again, where I could exist without being constantly reminded of the role I had played in their lives. I needed to be somewhere where I could find my own voice, my own space, my own place in the world. The next morning, I left the garage for the first time in days. I walked down the street, my steps slow but determined, the weight of my decision pressing down on me with each step. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I didn't even stop to pack a bag. I had only the clothes on my back and the small purse I carried with me, but that was enough. I didn't need anything else. I had spent so many years holding on to things, keeping track of everyone's needs, everyone's schedules, everyone's lives, that I had forgotten how to live for myself. Now, I was ready to change that. I walked for hours, not caring where I was going, just needing to put some distance between me and the house, between me and the people who had made me feel so small, so invisible. I didn't have a plan, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let them control me anymore. I wasn't going to let them define my worth. I was going to take charge of my life, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. As the sun began to set, I found myself standing in front of a small, run-down motel on the edge of town. The neon sign above the door flickered, casting an eerie glow over the parking lot. It wasn't much, but it was a place to start, a place to begin again. I walked inside and rented a room for the night, paying in cash, not caring about anything other than the fact that I was finally taking control of my own life. The room was small and bare, but it was mine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. I didn't have to worry about what anyone else thought, didn't have to worry about pleasing anyone. I could be alone, just for a while, and figure out what came next. I didn't know how long I would stay in that room or what I would do after, but in that moment, I felt a small flicker of hope, a flicker of something that had been buried deep inside me for far too long. I didn't call my son. I didn't reach out to him. I didn't know if I ever would. I didn't know if I would ever be able to forgive him for what he had done, for how he had treated me. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I needed his forgiveness. I didn't need anyone's approval. I was taking control of my own life, and that was all that mattered. That night, I lay in the small bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioner. I didn't sleep much, but I didn't mind. I wasn't waiting for anyone anymore. I wasn't waiting for permission. I was living for myself now, and that was enough. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again, and that was all I needed to start over. The days that followed my decision to leave were filled with a mixture of emotions I hadn't expected. At first, there was the sharp, overwhelming sense of relief, the kind of feeling you get when you finally shed a heavy burden you never realized had been weighing you down for years. I wasn't bound to anyone anymore. I wasn't beholden to anyone's expectations, no longer tied to a life that had never really been mine. I could breathe for the first time in years without the constant pressure of playing a role, mother, grandmother, caretaker, without the constant demand of being what everyone else needed me to be. But that relief didn't last long. Soon, a deep, gnawing emptiness began to settle in. The silence in the small motel room was deafening. I had spent so many years filling the spaces between me and my family, between me and the world, that now, with nothing left to hold on to, I found myself lost in the quiet. I hadn't been prepared for the loneliness that came with freedom. It was strange how quickly everything had unraveled. One moment, I was a part of a family, a fixture in their lives, and the next, I was nothing more than a ghost. It didn't matter that I had raised my son, that I had cared for him and provided for him when he was young, that I had always been there, in the background, doing whatever was asked of me. None of it seemed to matter now. They had moved on without me, and I was left behind, forgotten, left to fend for myself. And yet, deep down, I knew this was something I had allowed to happen. I had allowed myself to be invisible. I had allowed myself to be defined by them, by their needs and their expectations. I had spent so many years pouring everything I had into their lives, neglecting my own, that I had forgotten who I was. And now, in the stillness of this room, with no one to care for but myself, I was forced to face the woman I had become. I had no idea where I was going, no real plan. But that was the first time in my life that it didn't matter. For the first time, I wasn't answering to anyone else. I wasn't making decisions based on what they wanted or what they expected of me. I was free. And yet, That freedom came with a price. I could no longer hide behind my role as a mother, a grandmother. I could no longer define myself by the needs of others. I had to face the truth. I had no idea who I was without those labels. I had lived my entire life in service to others, and now that I was alone, I had to learn how to live for myself. It wasn't something I was prepared for, but it was something I had to do. I spent the first few days wandering, not knowing exactly where to go or what to do, but I knew I couldn't stay in the motel forever. I couldn't stay in a place where I was just waiting for something to happen, for someone to come and pull me out of the darkness. I had to take control of my own life, to create something for myself, even if it meant starting from scratch. I walked through the town, down unfamiliar streets, past shops I didn't recognize, through neighborhoods I'd never seen before. I didn't know where I was going, but somehow it felt like the right thing to do. I wasn't running away from my past, but I was walking away from it, step by step, inch by inch, until I found something new. I was searching for something I couldn't name, something that had been lost along the way. That was when I found it. A small, run-down house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was something. The yard was overgrown, the paint on the windows peeling, and the front door hung slightly ajar. But when I stepped inside, I felt a strange sense of peace. The house was empty, but there was something about it that felt familiar, like it had been waiting for me. I walked through the rooms, feeling the weight of the years in the creaking floorboards and the fading wallpaper. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had found a place that was mine. I knew I couldn't stay in the motel forever, but I also knew I couldn't just jump into a new life without any plan or support. So I made a decision. I would stay in this house for as long as it took to figure out what came next. I wasn't sure what that would be, but I knew I had to take the first step. The next morning, I woke up early and walked to the local diner, a small, greasy spoon that had a sign out front that read, "Help Wanted." It was the kind of place that didn't ask questions, didn't care about your past, didn't care about anything but whether you could show up and do the work. That's all I needed, a place to start, a way to earn a living, a way to prove to myself that I could do this on my own. The diner was small, with only a few booths and a counter where the regulars sat, drinking coffee and gossiping. I walked up to the counter and asked the waitress if they were hiring. She looked me over for a moment, then nodded and handed me an apron. "Can you start today?" she asked, her voice tired but kind. I nodded, not knowing what else to do but take the offer. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something. It was a way for me to begin again. The work was hard, the hours long, and the pay was barely enough to cover rent. But it was mine. For the first time in years, I wasn't living in the shadow of anyone else's expectations. I wasn't living for anyone but myself, and that made all the difference. The customers were kind enough, and I quickly fell into a rhythm. I learned the regulars' orders, figured out how to handle the rushes, and began to feel a sense of purpose again. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was a way to prove to myself that I could still contribute, that I could still build something, even if it wasn't the life I had once imagined for myself. As the weeks passed, I started to find a routine. I would wake up early, walk to the diner, work my shift, and then spend my afternoons walking through the town, exploring the places I had never seen before. I would go to the library, sit in the quiet corners, and read books I had never had time to read before. I would visit the small coffee shop down the street and talk to the barista who had become a friend about the things that had happened in my life, about the things I had learned. It was the kind of life I had never imagined for myself. But it was my life, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was living it on my own terms. But even as I settled into this new life, something inside me still felt unfinished. I hadn't heard from my son, not since I had left. I hadn't heard from anyone in my family. I knew they were still out there, still living their lives, but I didn't know if they were even thinking about me. I didn't know if they cared. And in the quiet moments, when I was alone in my room or sitting in the diner with my thoughts, I wondered if I would ever see them again. I wondered if they would ever reach out, if they would ever try to find me. But I didn't know if I wanted them to. I didn't know if I was ready to face them again, to face the people who had abandoned me, who had left me behind without a second thought. I couldn't go back to the way things were. I couldn't go back to being the woman I had been, but I wasn't sure who I was now, and that uncertainty made me feel small, made me feel like I was still searching for something. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew it was out there, waiting for me to find it. It was a rainy Thursday when I received the letter. The kind of letter that you don't expect but know is inevitable when you've been absent long enough. I had thought I could disappear into the silence, that my absence would be just another forgotten thing, something that slipped away unnoticed. But no, they had noticed. Of course they had. And there it was, the envelope that would change everything again. The one I had been waiting for in some way, even if I hadn't been ready to admit it to myself. I had been free for months, finding a rhythm in my new life, building something that was mine. But even in the quiet satisfaction of it all, I had known this moment would come. It had always come, in one form or another. I sat at the kitchen table of my small, rented room, the rain tapping gently against the window. I had just finished my shift at the diner, my feet sore from hours of walking the same floor, and the last thing I expected was a letter from them, from my family. The letter was from my son. It wasn't a call, it wasn't a text, no. This was a letter, an actual physical letter. He had chosen this form of communication, a written message, something I could hold in my hands, something that had weight. Unlike the words that had been flung at me before, I hesitated for a moment before opening it, my fingers trembling slightly. It was a strange feeling to hold something from them after so much time had passed, after I had made it so clear that I wasn't going to be a part of their carefully constructed world anymore. I wasn't sure if I was angry, relieved, or just resigned to the fact that this was the next stage in the process, the next chapter in the story of my estrangement. When I finally slid the paper from the envelope, I read the first few lines slowly, taking in each word as though they were foreign to me, as though I didn't recognize the person who had written them. "Mom," the letter began, "we've been trying to reach you. It's been over 3 months. Adam and I are really concerned. We don't know where you've gone or why you're doing this, but it's causing so much stress. The kids miss you. Please, we just want to know you're okay. We haven't heard from you in so long, and we need to know you're safe." I put the letter down on the table, staring at the words as though they were a riddle. Safe? It was a word I hadn't heard in relation to myself in years. The idea that they were concerned about my safety, about where I had gone or why I had left, felt surreal. It was as though the person who had written this letter was someone I didn't recognize, someone who had no real understanding of what had happened. "We just want to know you're okay." That was what it came down to. The "we" was them. It was always them. I wasn't sure if the letter was an attempt to be kind, or if it was simply a way to make themselves feel better about what they had done, about what they had forced me into. The same people who had abandoned me, left me in the garage with the rats, were now playing the role of the concerned family members, as though their actions hadn't shattered everything between us. I read the letter again, each word sinking deeper into my chest. It wasn't the apology I had been expecting. It wasn't the reconciliation I had secretly hoped for. It was a demand for answers, a request for me to come back into their lives. But I wasn't the same woman who had left that house, who had stayed in the background for so long, and I wasn't going to return to being that woman. I wasn't going to let them control me again, let them define me. I stared at the letter for a long time, wondering what to do with it, wondering what they expected from me. Did they want me to beg for their forgiveness? Did they think I would just walk back into their lives, as though nothing had changed, as though they hadn't thrown me away when they were done with me? The thought of it made my stomach turn. I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. I wasn't going to be the person they thought I was. I had walked away for a reason, and I wasn't going to go back, not until I knew what I wanted, not until I knew who I was without them. I put the letter in the drawer of the small, worn desk by the window. The rain had stopped, but the air outside still felt damp, thick with the weight of the unspoken things between us. The letter was a symbol, a reminder that the world I had left behind hadn't stopped moving, that they hadn't forgotten about me, even though they had pretended not to care. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. Part of me wanted to scream, to throw the letter into the trash and never look back. But another part of me, the part that had spent years loving them, wanted to respond, wanted to explain why I had left, why I had chosen to walk away. But that wasn't my job anymore. I wasn't the one who had abandoned them. I wasn't the one who had decided to throw away years of connection and love. I wasn't going to beg for an explanation, and I wasn't going to beg for forgiveness. I had been waiting for them to come to me, but I knew now that I couldn't wait anymore. I couldn't keep waiting for them to come around, for them to realize that what they had done was wrong. They wouldn't. They couldn't. Not without losing something themselves. And I wasn't going to be the one to make them see the truth. I wasn't going to be the one who gave up my own dignity just for the sake of their comfort. The following day, I didn't check the letter again. I didn't even look at it. I went to work, kept to my routine, and tried to focus on the life I was building here. I had made a decision, a choice to be on my own, and I wasn't going to let their manipulations, their guilt, pull me back into the life I had left behind. But that evening, as I sat in the small diner with a cup of coffee, the thought of the letter lingered in my mind like a shadow, refusing to go away. The door to the diner opened, and a familiar figure stepped inside. It was Joyce, the woman who ran the cafe down the street. She had become a quiet fixture in my life over the past few weeks, someone I could rely on without needing to explain myself. I had shared more with her than I had with anyone in years, though our conversations were never heavy. Joyce was a woman of few words, but when she spoke, her words were solid, real. She approached the counter and ordered her usual. When she turned to sit down, she glanced at me and gave a slight nod, as though acknowledging something unsaid. I stared into my coffee, feeling her eyes on me, knowing that Joyce knew more about me than I was ready to admit. She had never asked me questions, never probed about my past, but I knew she saw the way I held myself, the way I carried the weight of everything that had happened. I could feel it, this understanding between us. She knew She had seen people like me before, people who had been pushed to the edges of their families, people who had been made to disappear. And for the first time, I realized that she didn't need me to explain myself to her. She understood, in the quiet way that people who have lived know how to understand. And that's when it happened. The next morning, as I went about my usual routine, my son called. His voice was tight, filled with something I couldn't place. He sounded almost frantic. "Mom, I need to talk to you," he said, and for a brief moment, I almost gave in. I almost reached for the phone, almost agreed to have the conversation that I knew was coming. But then I remembered the letter, the weight of it, and I put the phone back down without saying a word. I wasn't ready. I wasn't sure if I ever would be. The decision came without warning, without the heavy weight of a decision-making process that I had expected. For weeks, I had avoided contact with my son and the rest of the family, telling myself that I was finally free, finally living for myself. But something about the silence had begun to gnaw at me. I had grown used to the peace, to the rhythm of my days. But there was always this undertow of something unsaid, an unspoken tension that I couldn't ignore anymore. It had been too long, I realized, since I had heard their voices, since I had felt the sting of their absence. I had pushed it all away, buried it in the quiet of my new life, but it was becoming impossible to keep it buried any longer. The truth was, no matter how much I told myself that I didn't care, that I had moved on, there was still a part of me that wanted them back, that wanted my family back. And then the call came. The call that I had both expected and dreaded, the one that would change everything, the one I had been avoiding for so long. It wasn't the letter that had set everything in motion. It wasn't the constant thoughts I had about them. It wasn't the nagging guilt or the slow realization that I couldn't live my life in this quiet exile. No, it was the sound of my son's voice on the other end of the line. I hadn't spoken to him since I had left, hadn't heard from him directly, and the sound of his voice, strained and uncertain, was enough to bring all the pain back, to bring everything crashing down in a way I hadn't anticipated. "Mom, I need to talk to you." His voice cracked slightly, the words stumbling out as if they didn't fit the situation. The words were familiar in a way, but they were also foreign. This wasn't the son who had told me so many months ago to wait in the airport lounge, to wait for him and his family. The son who had left me behind without a second thought. No, this was someone else, someone who was now looking for answers. Someone who was now trying to piece together the fragments of a life that had been shattered. I could hear the desperation in his voice, the regret, the guilt that had started to seep in. But there was something else there, too. Something I wasn't sure I could trust. Was this real? Was this apology genuine? Or was it just another attempt to pull me back into their lives, to make me fit into a role I had spent so long trying to escape? I didn't answer right away. I sat there in the small room, the phone in my hand, my heart racing as I processed what I had just heard. For a moment, I wanted to hang up, to end the conversation before it even began, to tell him that I wasn't interested in hearing his excuses, his justifications for what had happened. I had left, hadn't I? I had walked away from them and their world, and I had made a decision not to look back. But then, something inside me, something I hadn't expected, stirred. Was I ready to let go of everything? Was I really prepared to leave it all behind? To walk away from a lifetime of love, pain, and memories? The silence between us was heavy, but it was necessary. I had to decide. Finally, I pressed the phone to my ear and spoke. "What do you want, Adam?" My voice was steady, though I could feel the tremor in my chest, the years of hurt and betrayal threatening to spill over. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but his answer wasn't it. "I don't know how to fix this, Mom," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "I don't know where you are, what's happened, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't want to lose you. We've been looking for you, trying to find you, but it's like you just disappeared. You left us, and I just need to know you're okay. I need to know you're still alive. Please just let me know you're okay." The words hit me harder than I had expected. They were raw, vulnerable, and for a moment I felt something deep inside me stir. But it wasn't the warmth of forgiveness that I felt. No, it was something different. It was the cold, bitter realization that none of this would have happened if he had just thought of me before, if he had just cared enough to reach out when I was still there, when I was still part of their world. It wasn't enough for me to hear the apology now. It wasn't enough to hear the regret in his voice. What did any of it matter when it was all too little, too late? I stood up, pacing the room, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Could I really go back to that life? Could I really step back into a world that had abandoned me without a second thought? I wasn't sure I could, and yet there was a part of me that wanted to, a part of me that missed them, that still loved them, despite everything that had happened. My son, my family. I had spent so many years loving them, sacrificing for them, and now they wanted to tear down the walls I had built around myself. They wanted to take me back into their world, but could I trust them again? Could I trust him again? "Why didn't you come for me, Adam?" I asked, the words coming out before I could stop them. "Why didn't you check on me? Why didn't you care enough to make sure I was okay when I needed you the most?" The anger I had been holding on to for months flooded out of me, sharp and bitter. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the power of my own voice. It wasn't just the question I was asking. It was everything. The years of sacrifice, the years of being invisible, the years of waiting for them to notice me, to see me, to care for me the way I had always cared for them. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more fragile. "I didn't know, Mom. I thought you'd be okay. I didn't think you would just disappear. And I was wrong. I was so wrong. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix this." "Maybe you can't," I said, my voice steady now, no longer filled with rage, but with something deeper, something more painful. "Maybe this isn't something that can be fixed. Maybe it's too late for that." There was silence for a long time, the kind of silence that hangs heavy in the air, thick with all the things that haven't been said. I realized, in that moment, that I didn't need to hear any more apologies, any more excuses. What had happened, and no amount of words could change that. What mattered now was what I was going to do next. What mattered now was me. "I'm not coming back, Adam," I said, my voice finally steady, the decision made. "I can't. I've spent my whole life living for others, living for you, and I can't do that anymore. I'm not the woman I was. I'm not the woman who waited in that damn airport lounge, who waited for you to care. I've moved on. I've built a life for myself, and I'm not going to let you pull me back into the same cycle of waiting, of being invisible, of being what you want me to be. Another long pause. But this time, I didn't feel the need to fill it. I didn't feel the need to explain myself any further. He had heard me, and he had to accept it. We both did. I understand, he said quietly. I just want you to know that I love you. And I'm sorry. I know, I said. And then I hung up the phone. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was simply the right thing to do. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of finality. I had made my decision. I had chosen myself. And nothing would change that. When I finally hung up the phone, the weight that I had carried for so many years did not vanish, but something changed inside me in its place. Something solid and heavy enough to anchor me in the world rather than let me drift in silence. I stood by the window and watched the sky shift from pale lavender to gold as dawn broke. The light spilling through thin curtains and touching the edges of things I thought I had lost, reminding me that some memories fade, but some truths remain persistent, irrevocable, and that I was done making myself small, waiting for someone else to decide who I was allowed to be. I remember breathing in the air of that morning, noticing the scents of rain on pavement and damp earth, the small perfume of coffee from my kitchen, and something inside me eased, not because I believed they understood, or because they acknowledged what they had done, but because I had finally claimed my own voice, spoken my own name without apology, allowed my own heart to pulse with need and anger and hope, all at once, without shame. I packed a bag with clothes I would wear, books I had read but never taken back, pens I had bought in hopeful moments, photographs that I might frame but maybe simply hold. I left behind things I no longer needed, things that reminded me of being invisible. An old shawl, fraying at the edges that I never wore, the brittle mat by my bed that creaked under my feet, even small items, a spoon with a chip, a mug with a faded design, all relics of being tolerated rather than seen. I walked out of the motel room carrying only what felt like me. Outside, the air was crisp in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, full of possibility. And when I closed the door behind me, I did not glance back. For the first time, not longing, not regretting, only aware that something I had been carrying was finally released. I found a small apartment not far from the diner, somewhere modest, with pale walls and high windows, unassuming furniture, a bed with clean sheets, a window facing sky, and every day I woke to light instead of darkness. I cooked my own meals, sometimes burning the toast, sometimes sipping tea in a chipped cup, sometimes letting the smell of onions fill the kitchen and realizing joy could live in ordinary acts. I walked through streets I had never explored before, listening to the laughter of children, the rumble of buses, the voices of strangers, and in that cacophony, I felt alive, no longer just a witness to my own absence, but a participant in my own story. People nodded when I passed. They did not know my past, but their recognition, simple and polite, reminded me I still belonged somewhere. I tended small things. A plant on the windowsill whose leaves stubbornly reached for light. Books I arranged in neat rows. Letters I wrote to myself, not for them. Reminders that I had a self worthy of care and kindness, and that life had not stopped. Because they had tried to erase me. Time went on, not in leaps, but in gentle rhythms, days folding into weeks, weeks into months, and I learned how to hope without holding my breath, how to want without trembling, how to endure the echoes of old pain without letting them define the shape of my future. One afternoon, I visited a park bench, sat there watching the shadows of trees shift across the grass, and for the first time, I felt a quiet gratitude for the scars I bore, because they reminded me how much I had survived, how much courage I had in still breathing, still caring, still walking forward. I thought of my son sometimes, of memories both bitter and beautiful, and in the stillness I forgave neither fully nor completely, because forgiveness is not a destination. But I released the demand that others see me as I saw myself. That was the true liberation. Not waiting any longer, not forcing reconciliation, but deciding I was enough. Always had been. One evening, I sat with Joyce in her small kitchen, her laughter bright, warm light on her face, tea steeping, the windows open to a breeze that carried the scent of jasmine. We did not speak of my past, at least not in detail, but we spoke of the everyday things. The way light falls across a table, the way coffee tastes when it is just right, the way silence can be a kindness. She asked how I felt now, and I realized I could answer with no tremor, no catch in my throat, only a calm voice coming from my core, saying I feel seen. And in that, I understood. The night they dragged my bed into the garage, the morning they carried theirs into the street. These were chapters, not the book itself. My story would continue, not through what others did to me, but through what I chose for myself next. I no longer needed to be defined by their absence, nor by their approval. I needed only to live with purpose, to walk through each dawn knowing I had chosen to rise, that I had reclaimed the dignity they tried to take. And though my hands trembled sometimes, and though nights still came with shadows, I held tight to hope, to the belief that even when we are broken, we can build again from the fragments. And in that building, there is a grace no one else can give.